Oh, no.
Intro.
Oh, okay.
All right, and welcome to the November 3rd edition of Going Viral at GoingViral.news. My name is Jim Dingeman. I'm joined with Ken Aaron, Alex Stavropoulos, Steve Jonas, someone else. I assume that's Michael, or maybe that's Ken. And we'll have Michael Jankowitz joining us in a few minutes. I wanted to read some of the headlines before we get into the meat of the show, and I'm going to basically turn it over to Alex with his clips. Well, obviously, we're going to talk out of this about what happened yesterday with the elections in Virginia and New Jersey and around the country. We had in Buffalo a socialist candidate defeated in a write-in campaign, and we also had Mr. McAuliffe defeated by the Trump-supported candidate in that race in Virginia. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But let's just go over some of the news today. Iran has announced that they want to resume talks on a nuclear deal after a 5-month gap. There's reports about what is going on with Beijing increasing its nuclear arsenal much faster than thought. They're adding 300 additional silos out there where they have their nuclear arms in Xinjiang province. The Ahmed Arbery murder trial is underway, and some talk about as this being a trial, a test of racial justice in the heart of white supremacy in the South. We also have the Rittenhouse trial going on in Kenosha in Wisconsin, and we'll see how that turns out. Now, I wanted to just focus in on what happened today at the COP26 event in Glasgow. Country pledges at COP26 included that they would try to limit temperature rises to below 2 degrees centigrade. More than 20 countries and financial institutions have vowed to halt all financing for fossil fuel development overseas and divert the remaining $8 billion a year to green energy. We also have India committing to a staggering buildup of solar power, and literally hundreds of world business banks and pension funds around the world have committed to a key climate goal to basically knock down and have zero emissions by 2015 in all the efforts they finance. There was a discussion about the heat waves and wildfires that caused devastation in Europe, and they argued and agreed that this would not have happened without global heating and warming. And a secret investor court system poses a real threat to the Paris Climate Agreement. Governments are taking action to phase out fossil fuels as they face a slew of multi-million-dollar lawsuits for lost profits. But data shows a surge in cases under the Energy Treaty that basically allows energy corporations to sue governments over policies that hurt their profits. I should add that in Afghanistan today, or yesterday, attack on a medical hospital in Kabul, where a suicide bomber and a group of combatants, probably from ISIS Khorasan, came in and killed, wounded both from the Afghan National Army and the Taliban in a hospital inside Kabul itself. Now, in the situation in Ethiopia is getting more aggravated and worse. There is a call for mobilization by the Ethiopian government because the Tigrayans are actually now maneuvering to attack Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. And so we'll maybe have time to talk about that. And also in Sudan, the issue of what is going on with the coup there is quite interesting, and I will want to talk about that later in the show. But first, we wanted to talk about what happened yesterday. All the pundits and all the magazines and newspapers today were devoted to all their analyses of what occurred in this election. We always know that off-year elections always spell doomsday for the incumbent party in the White House, but this is a particularly interesting set of circumstances, and we'll get into it later. But first, let Ken introduce a piece that talks about this from the news. Kenny?
Okay.
To you?
Yeah, let's see. Is it coming up? There it is. And we play it. Can you hear it?
Can't hear it.
Okay.
Need to share the sound.
Yeah, share the sound. Let me see. I can't stop the live stream. Can you pull it up or anybody pull it up? Let me see what it is. No, it should be on. Oh, I know why. 1 second.
I usually blame these things on Trump.
Uh-huh.
Why not?
Yeah, why not? He's a good scapegoat, convenient scapegoat.
Go.
Let's see.
The language is getting slaughtered tonight. Oh,
All right. Well, as
No.
he's getting the sound working,
Yeah.
the key thing of this is that I was looking at Dana Milbank, who I know personally, his column in the Washington Post today, where he basically said, "Look, Biden, if he had had the Build Back America bill passed several weeks ago, with a further, are you getting it there, Kenny?
Not yet. Go ahead.
All right. Well, if he'd had the Build Back America bill passed a couple of weeks ago, the focus would have been on how it's going to benefit millions and millions of people, instead of the perception it's a bunch of Democrats haggling away in Washington, D.C. And we had, of course, I think today the New Jersey gubernatorial race was called for the Governor Murphy, but I'm sure that that's going to be contested in court by the Republican running against him. But Steve, let me throw it to you, because this, what does this mean? What, like, do you agree with all this doom and gloom assessments as to what they're saying about this? I mean, what does it matter that a neoliberal president who has his own flaws, so I'm sure we're going to hear this from Alex, basically got thumped in the state of Virginia for a whole variety of reasons? What do you make of all this?
well, first of all, I don't think it was that Biden got fucked. I think the Democrats picked the worst possible candidate.
He's setting off a new round of Democratic finger pointing around the country, but especially on Capitol Hill. Virginia Senator Mark Warner blaming Democrats in Congress for not passing a bipartisan infrastructure bill that he says could have helped both Biden and Terry McAuliffe. Savannah, expect to hear a lot more of that kind of talk in the weeks ahead.
Well, that's the end
Thanks
of it.
for watching our YouTube channel. Find your favorite recipes, celebrity interviews, uplifting stories, shop our favorite deals.
Okay, so the end of that commercial. So that was it. But basically, the guy won because mostly, I think it was 53% said because of the school faux pas, where he said, the Democratic candidate said, no, the parents can't control what is taught to the children. And then later on, and it was manipulated by the press, he said, and this is just, I was really shocked by this. He said the population in Virginia is, I think he said 40% black and 65% white, but the schools are 80% black. And there's not enough, there's too many white teachers. So he should have just said there aren't enough black teachers to teach and be role models. Instead, he said there's too many white teachers. So on top of saying that the parents can't control what's taught to the children, they shouldn't, was taken to mean they have no say on it. So that motivated 50% of the voters, whether they were Republican, Democrat, or independent. And that's why he lost. And I think he lost significantly. I think he didn't lose by a point or two. That's basically what they reported.
Right. Okay. Well, Steve, jump in there. What's your comment about all this?
Yeah, well, starting at the beginning, I mean, McAuliffe is a terrible candidate. He was and Ken just illustrated some of the reasons why he was a terrible candidate. He wasn't a great governor in Virginia. First of all, second of all, yes, it would have been really nice if the Build Back Better program and the infrastructure program had been passed. They are being stopped by the 51st Republican, and we all know who that is. The point is, if you got a pile of shit and you're running in an election, what you want to do is coat this shit and make it look good. And the way you would do, this is my first point, the way you would do that in this case is to say, look at all the things that President Biden has brought us in a very short time. The first thing he brought us was a COVID-19 pandemic that was out of control under President Trump, a pandemic that we were told by one of the people who was in the room with Trump, if Trump had done anything like the right thing in public health, 135 to 150,000 lives could have been saved. So you run against Trump on COVID, you run for Biden on COVID. The second thing is that the COVID relief package, which benefited lots and lots of people, was enacted under Biden. And so you promote that. Then you also make an advantage out of the fact that there is a series of legislative proposals in Congress that are among the most progressive, that are the most progressive since the Great Society, that of course Congress has to consider issues very carefully. There's always a lot of back and forth, but we are pushing this and there is something good that is going to come out of this. That's the positives that I would use. The negative that I would use is, well, first of all, McAuliffe made a big mistake about parents and schools, and there were other people who have made mistakes like that too. The way you handle that question is, of course, parents have influence in what children learn in schools through their school boards. That's it. And you just talk about school boards over and over again. And you avoid the question of whether parents can talk directly to teachers, whether they should go into classrooms, et cetera, et cetera. That's what school boards are for. School boards are there to represent the parents. Then the third thing is that I would have said, now, I'm not the candidate and my advisors might tell me not.
Go ahead.
Froze.
Go ahead.
He froze.
Oh, he's frozen. Okay.
Yeah, he's frozen.
Okay, Teddy just joined us. Yes?
Ted Cook. We'll bring Steve back when he unfreezes. But what we're talking about, Ted, is what happened yesterday around the country in all these races. And we're joined with Ted Cook, who is a professor of history at William Patterson University out there in New Jersey. Ted is an eminent scholar on Asia, but we're asking him to talk about American politics. So, Ted, please chime in there.
Right. And, Ted, since you're in New Jersey, you can talk about Governor Murphy, too, and his race, what you thought about that.
Ted, you just have to unmute.
Yeah, I got it. I got it unmuted. I just asked my students how many voted. I had a class of 26 today. 3 voted. So that's one of the reasons that people didn't, the Governor Murphy or anyone else in northern New Jersey didn't do all that well. That's compared to what happened in 2020 when almost everyone voted. But it was a complete shock to me. Murphy is not the most dramatically personal person, but he didn't seem to have gotten trapped at any issue. No one ever talked about the so-called Jack about to sweep him away. But apparently they took it for granted. And a lot of people decided that the most important issue in New Jersey was property taxes, which it usually is almost every year. But we're concerned, and most of us who teach in New Jersey have been concerned over the last couple of decades, and not only Republicans, but also Democrats too, about their lack of support for high secondary education. And that has been a real problem for us, teaching in New Jersey. And the fact that Sweeney, the head of the Senate, may or may not have lost. I haven't heard finally whether he lost. I know he was behind, that's almost a bigger thing than knocking out Murphy. So that's about all. I don't have a lot to comment on the relationship between the state of New Jersey and the voters of New Jersey, and the shock that I had last night. I couldn't believe it. I turned it on late. I've been, of course, following Virginia and seeing what sort of looked like the unfolding disaster there. But then I looked up, and then the number kept getting worse, and I couldn't quite understand it. Yeah, that's about it.
All right, thanks.
The race has been called for Murphy.
Yeah. Okay, Ted, you got Kenny, you got to mute Ted because he's got that background noise. Steve, continue.
Yeah, I got cut off. If I could just finish my remarks.
Yeah, go on, please. You froze. Yeah. You actually froze in the middle of the air there.
Yeah. What I wanted to say was, I think that first of all, in talking about parents having an input into what goes on in schools, you say, and it's correct, parents have a great deal of influence on what goes on in schools through their school boards, not in the attempt to deal with individual teachers and individual curricula. The second thing on that is that ad about the awful book that her son was forced to read 10 years ago, the way the woman described it, it sounded like it was pornographic. But it was of course, it was by Toni Morrison. Of course, it was her best-known book, Beloved, by a Pulitzer Prize and Nobel Prize winning author. And it was about slavery, which was a terrible institution, and slaves suffered terribly. And that's what the book is about. And the third thing is that, this would have to be considered carefully, how to turn the race issue around. And that is my suggestion, at least to throw open to a staff meeting for a candidate, would be to use, as I said, I love the passive tense. It can be, if used properly, it can be extremely useful. So in attacking the open racism of or actually in this case, the shuttered racism, but the racism nevertheless of this candidate, you would say, I would say to the voters that you really do not want to fall into following racist tropes that are used only to distract you from the real issues. Last thing is, what's the program of Youngkin for Virginia? He never talked about it. McAuliffe can say, this is what I want to do, this is what I want to do, this is what I want to do. But you attack Youngkin, where's the legislative strategy? He was running only on, you're a bad guy, Biden's a bad guy, and then the hidden but very open message of racism.
All right, thanks, Steve. And Ted, when you come back on, you just have to turn the TV down. Alex, what do you think about all this? I know you have a different point of view than we do.
Right. Well, Ashley, can I show something? Because I want to show the breakdown of just to illustrate here. Here. So here again, this is a current breakdown again of the Virginia legislature. Okay, which you can see again, both houses with a Democrat majority. So that of course means, Governor Youngkin's ability to get some crazy right-wing things done, or say, pass new voter ID laws or such, and they're going to be circumscribed. And from what I've read about him, again, obviously a lot of the rhetoric from the Democrats was, this guy's a crazy Trumper, but from what I've read about him, he essentially is pretending to be a Trumper and is just a run-of-the-mill Republican, which is bad enough. But he's not a crazy lunatic. So there's that little silver lining on the cloud there, shall we say? So and again, we like I agree with Steve totally that we have no real idea what he intends to do. So probably it's just going to be the usual Republican stuff about, maybe trying to cut taxes or again, maybe he will try and introduce some legislation on critical race theory, and it'll be interesting to see what the Democratic legislature will do with that. But again, yeah, and of course, then the fact that he ran on that is like, what's his mandate is to do what? he If you didn't run basically on anything to do anything, then what is your mandate to do anything literally? What is he?
I
What does he have backing to do?
I could put in on something like that. I happened to pick up a commercial when I was researching this, and he said he's going to cut some taxes, or
of course, yeah,
and
Again,
save
typical
money and give and as I said, like most politicians, all women will lose 20 pounds and all men will go from 6 inches to 8 inches, maybe 10. And that's it, and that's what you say before they vote. And then afterwards, you go to the country club. So he just made a standard political thing. I'm going to do what's right.
Well, we'll see what happens. Now, we lost, unfortunately, Ted. Hopefully he'll come back. Mike, what's your comment about what happened yesterday around the country in all these elections? Michael?
Well, yeah. I think it's again probably low turnout. Ted made that point as well. Low turnout, certain amount of apathy. I guess maybe we just keep on overestimating the American public. And people are now saying, well, that means that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, in other words, has to be toned down, and we went too far on the left. I mean, maybe there's a couple of areas that's true. I think maybe what it is that the Democratic Party has to get it together and congeal a little bit, be able to put forward a unified statement rather than looking like it's 14 different parties combined into one. I mean, the Republican Party obviously is 2 different parties combined into one. Well, not combined at this point, but one of them is the overwhelming majority, which is the far right racist wing. And I think maybe, we keep on getting surprised as to how backwards, willfully stupid, not naturally stupid, but willfully stupid, and probably racist this country is. We just keep on getting surprised. This whole thing about, first of all,
I'm buying a ticket to France tomorrow.
No, my place is Canada, but doesn't matter. And I can't. Nobody can get into any place permanently now.
Yeah.
So, but the thing is that, as far as the school now, parents, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, but when I was a kid, parents didn't tell teachers what to teach. That kind of defeated the purpose of the school, because parents taught the kids at home and teachers taught them in school. Parents wanted a certain level of education, and there were certain limits that they didn't want them to cross. But it seems like maybe parents don't have the capacity anymore to deal with their kids, so they're totally dependent on the schools, and therefore they want to have a say in everything that goes on. Added on top of that, they obviously are being motivated, a lot of these parents, by racism, or at the very least, a lack of discernment. So if that's what they're voting on about this school issue.
Okay, thanks.
Can I make a quick comment on what?
Go for it.
I think we have to remember that there was one specific example of a parent claiming that they should have direct input into curriculum. This was from an 8-year-old ad. Whatever his name is, Youngkin couldn't find anything else. He couldn't find anything contemporary. He couldn't find a group of parents who are complaining now that they have no input. This was pulled. It was clearly a racist ad. She never mentioned the book. She never mentioned Toni Morrison. And an attack. What Democrats do not do well, the Republicans do very well, is attack. Always attack, never defend. If Democrats could ever learn that lesson, Democrats would do much better. But it was BS that this is about generically parents having more input, direct input into curricula. This was one parent talking about a book on the history of slavery 8 years ago.
Right. That was Ms. Murphy. And obviously look, we talked about this months ago when this all began, when you had all this stirring up of critical race theory around the country, which was ridiculous to start with because, I remember reading that kind of stuff like 40 years ago. And I didn't necessarily agree with all of it. I didn't necessarily agree with critical race theory, but it was, frankly, it was a great issue. When you look at actual content of the media, they were going bananas during the summer mentioning critical race theory. You actually look at what the networks did, particularly Fox and the other right-wing channels. They just kept on going on and on and on, and then they stopped in September. They started to ease off in September. But it did have a political impact. And I should add that in the race in Virginia, there are 4 seats for the Senate that are still up for grabs. So it's not completely over yet. They could lose control. And I just wanted to shift quickly into what's affecting us here in New York. Because today they tried once again to get a voting rights bill passed in the Senate. It didn't, of course, succeed. But in the state of New York, there were 3 amendments. There were 5 amendments on the ballot yesterday, and they basically all had to do with increasing voter turnout. One would have required incarcerated New Yorkers to be counted at their last place of residence. Another proposal would have eliminated a rule requiring voters to register at least 10 days before an election. And another would have removed a rule requiring voters to provide an excuse, such as they are leaving town or incapacitated, when requesting an absentee ballot. The right wing mobilized to defeat those. And I don't recall the Democratic Party doing much. I did get something from the borough president in Manhattan about it, but I didn't really see them actually running to make a big deal about that. And that's where I sort of have to blame the Democratic committee in the state of New York and others, because these are important issues to actually increase the ability of people to vote. And they didn't. I don't know what the hell they did. They just let the ball drop. I don't know. But what do you have to say about that, Alex?
On that, Jim, I think there's quite a bit of evidence that the Democrats as well in New York, they don't want everybody to vote. Well, we should all remember what happened in the 2016 Democrat primary, where they illegally removed more than 100,000 likely Bernie voters in Brooklyn, and there's been other shenanigans that they've done so my guess would be, again, that's why the Democrats, there was no official Democratic Party push for this, because they don't want everybody to vote any more than the Republicans do.
Well, okay, that. Yeah. All right. Well, that I agree with is a structural comment about American politics in general. That usually in down ballot races in general, when you're running in a primary, you only want the faithful to come out. I mean, that's true structurally. That's like an American political science 101 type thing. But again, I'd like to know more about what happened, because these were put forth as measures to increase turnout. And what happened? Nothing. And finally, before we turn it over to go on,
Jim,
Steve.
One thing, could you talk about the two that passed? Could you mention the 2 that passed?
Well, why don't you? I'm not. I was just concentrating on the negative right now.
Oh.
I wasn't necessarily following the 2 that passed. I just was looking at stuff that had to do with the ones that didn't pass. I think one passed about judges. I did vote on it yesterday, and when I voted, there was only one scanner working for where I was. So I called Gail Brewer's office. But anyway, the other one I believe.
Water, the right to clean water.
Jim, just let us know.
The water one.
Was this in the Bronx you were voting?
No, I was voting in Manhattan. You're right. One is water, and the other one had to do with judiciary issues. And so I think it was on the amount of money that one could sue or the amount you could collect. So it didn't really directly have to do with voting. But I would, and on the issue of water, before we bring Alex on to talk about the stories he wants to talk about today, there was a pretty heavy-duty report that came out of all this COP26 stuff. And they're talking about how the Greenland ice sheet is melting at a much faster rate. Big surprise. And that they predict that the sea levels could rise nearly a foot higher by the end of the century. And what blew my mind is that right now, the amount of water released between 2011 and 2020 by the melting of the Greenland ice sheet is 3.5 trillion tons of water, of basically the ice sheet melting, which would be enough to flood all of New York City in 14,700 feet of water. All right. And if it keeps on going up, by the end of the century, we'll have a 20-foot rise throughout the world if the entire ice sheet melts. So, and this is it's just amazing that we are always in these power politics issues where countries, of course, are putting their own self-interest above, which is understandable, above the interests of humanity. But that's not a big surprise. Anyway, Alex, let me turn it over to you with the stories you want to talk about.
Okay, so let me start with breaking news that I just saw a few minutes ago, which is this. I don't know if you've heard about this, Jim, that apparently the Algerians are claiming that the country of Morocco attacked them with drones and killed in the disputed area, territory that's disputed between, again, going back to the colonial period.
Pump that up full screen.
Yeah. So again, this is something. Obviously, this is, since this involves claiming the government did this. Hey, we might even get a war out of this. So this could be big.
Well, this bombing is clearly another low point in Morocco-Algeria relations. Remember, they don't have diplomatic relations at the moment. Those diplomatic ties were severed in August of this year. A couple of things really came to a head this summer. In July, the Moroccan ambassador to the UN distributed a note which expressed support for an armed group in Algeria that is fighting for secession in the Kabylie region. And that actually fits into a long pattern of both countries accusing each other of supporting rebel or armed groups to destabilize the central governments of both countries. And then there was the spying scandal as well, which came to a head this summer, where it transpired that Morocco had targeted more than 6,000 Algerians, including senior military and political officials. So all of this led to this severance, as I said, of diplomatic relations on August the 24th. After that, things got even worse, Nadia, because then the Algerian government announced that the gas pipeline, which runs through Morocco, was not going to be renewed after it expired. That expiry has just happened, actually, on October the 31st. So there's a kind of economic divorce in a way, as well as a political divorce. And it's hard to see how the two countries kind of claw things back the way that they have done after previous periods of tension. In 2004, 2006, for example, they took measures to waive visas for each other as a way of kind of breaking the ice after previous difficult periods. Now, because there are so many things piling up, going wrong in this bilateral relationship, it's hard to see how they can really get out of this hole. I suppose there's perhaps one thing that is working against a further escalation between Morocco and Algeria, and that is the whole regional situation. So the fact that there is now this political crisis in Tunisia and ongoing instability in Libya, that might have a kind of cooling effect on heads in Rabat and Algiers. But
Yeah, so obviously that's serious, and we have some military analysis from South Front about what actually happened and what the governments are saying. So here again, so apparently this drone strike happened on the 1st. Again, on the 67th anniversary. I wonder if that's deliberate by the Moroccans of the success of their revolution. Yeah, three Algerian truck drivers were cowardly murdered, barbaric bombing of their trucks. Yeah. To again the Western Sahara. Again, they of course refer to the Moroccan forces against a disputed territory. But separatist forces, again, as you heard from France 24, backed by, well, at least rhetorically, maybe materially also by the Algerian government. So, yeah. So again, all right. So there's, let's see. Okay, so again, well, you can see, let's see what, I guess this is video footage of the trucks that were, so you can see they were obviously just blown up by whatever drone hit them. Again, yeah, so here the Moroccans are, of course, denying, saying they ran into a landmine. But, well, again, that doesn't look like a landmine again. And, of course, again, this is an issue of the increasing use of drone warfare. Again, we saw what happened in the Nagorno-Karabakh, the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict, which, of course, we covered a bit. And apparently, it looks likely that, again, that the wars used to attack the Algerians here were, again, Turkish TB2 Bar Yakhtar drones. Again, the same, which were also, again, used and are pretty good in, again, the Armenia, well, used by the Azerbaijanis against Armenia to quite a bit of success. So obviously, this is, among other things, showing the escalation of the use of drone technology in warfare. So here, yeah, they've broken ties, and obviously this is something that we may see break out into a full-scale war.
Where did you say that? Where did the drones come from? Where did you say?
Well, again, obviously from somewhere in Morocco, but I mean, the Algerians aren't. I don't think aren't yet saying, they flew from this base or anything like that.
Right, but
Do you know which country is supplying the drones?
Well, again, it's a Turkish-built drone.
All right, but Alex, what's deeper in this? What we're seeing here is that there's been a division between Algeria and Morocco for quite a long time over Polisario.
Oh, sure.
Because the backing of Algeria, Polisario, is what led to the basically what's interesting in this situation is Morocco had been basically leaning to get support from the United States. And during the Trump administration, part of the trade-off for them to go along with the Abraham Accords, which basically normalized the relations with Israel, is that they wanted to have support from the United States of a belligerent attitude towards Algeria. So what you're seeing right now is the manifestation of that. And, they basically broke off relations between the two countries in August of this year. And so the question of how this is going to work out, and I'll throw another thing in there, is that they were asking Israel to come in as an observer in terms of because they asked the African Union to come in and mediate these dispute, and they asked Israel to come in, and of course the Algerians didn't agree with that. So it's a very interesting situation, and if you put into that further south in the Maghreb, you have the whole question of what's going on between the various jihadist movements that are operating there. So anyway, that's just some background. Oh, we lost Steve. Oh, well. Okay, go on, Alex.
All right. So, well, one of the things in the background that we talked about quite a bit, but not recently. It's reminded by this from Democracy. This, again, is Dr. Harriet Fraud, who does this program for Democracy at Work, Capitalism Hits Home. And, the important thing is that a lot of the eviction moratoriums expired at the end of October. And we're, of course, not hearing anything specifically yet about that. But obviously, this is something that's going to be an increasing issue. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Americans getting evicted over the next few months. And what the hell is that going to do to the country? So here she talks, again, she's practicing psychiatrist. So she talks here about, what the psychological effects are of having or not having a home, which is interesting. Yeah.
Well, she's Richard Wolff's wife.
Right, yeah.
46 states will allow evictions by October 31st, the end of this month of October. So many million, 41 million people are in danger of losing their homes, and their children, of course, lose them too. This is an area where capitalism literally hits home where we live. Capitalist housing market is actually a threat to life itself for 40 million Americans. Well, what are the necessities of life? What would give you a right to life, a real right to life? One would be healthy food. Also, clean water is required for life. And as we know from Newark's scare with the lead in the water, from Flint, Michigan's polluted water, and from water everywhere, all Americans don't have access to clean, healthy water. We need breathable, clean air. You need rest and restorative sleep, which means you can't be required to work swing shifts where you're on days 1 week, nights the other, and you don't know how to plan. Because sleep requires a reasonable, predictable rhythm. You need shelter. You need shelter from rain and wind. You also need temperature regulation so that you can't get freezing cold in the winter or over 100 degrees hurting you in the summer. Well, Americans don't necessarily get that. And they certainly don't get that on the streets. What people need for mental health is attachment to people they can trust. They need reliable, consistent bonds with other people they can count on. They need to know what will happen to them. They need to have some control over their lives. They need to avoid pain and have some self-enhancement possibility. They also need connection to the outer world, to a sense of agency that they can do something in their world. None of those bonds, none of those things can happen easily if one is evicted and homeless. So we are subjecting people to a constant fear of insecurity, of physical danger, and of anxiety. Even the threat of eviction makes people so anxious that their bodies change. The children of people threatened with eviction when they are born are low birth weight, small, and less viable than the children that are born out of people living in safe conditions. So, US capitalism in its private housing market has abandoned 1 out of 10 of us. They've really hit home.
Okay, so, well, again, obviously that's something should be keeping in mind as, to be on the watch for, again, how many people are going to be evicted. I'm sure, well, Steve, of course, can also tell us some more practical, directly medical things that can happen, again, when you're evicted, and I'm sure, which I'm sure are, the health effects physically. Must be,
All right. So before you bring Steve in here, look, the ACLU in California, they made it. I think there was an op-ed piece where they issued a study just recently about the homelessness issue in the state of California. And I must admit that I'm looking at people on the street in Manhattan, and I see more street people, homeless people on the streets all over the place, building up little encampments. Even Gail freaks out that down the street from her on West 94th Street in West End. There's literally 3 little mini encampments in a block and a half area. Now, Harriet Fraid, it's, yeah, I don't need a Marxist shrink to tell me that it sucks to be homeless or be fearful of eviction. But let me bring Steve in on this one.
Well, I don't have too much to add to what the psychiatrist talked about. I mean, the physical effects of homelessness are quite obvious. One is the constant variations in temperature that the body is at least in modern times. Most people who have been living in shelter for most of their lives, their bodies are not as attuned to sudden changes in temperature, which between daytime and nighttime, depending upon the time of year, could be 20 or 30 degrees. The second thing, of course, is the what happens to health because of inadequate nutrition, which always accompanies homelessness. Then all the psychological factors that the psychiatrist talked about. But to me, I think most people in this panel would agree. I mean, this shows this is one of the major consequences of capitalism, that housing exists certainly for landlords, primarily to make money, not primarily to provide shelter for every person in the population. And obviously homelessness has been getting worse, particularly in, I understand, in Los Angeles. It's reached epidemic, if I may say so, proportions. I haven't been in the city in a long time, so I haven't seen it myself, but you folks who live in the city have seen it. I don't know, I'd like to hear other people's ideas on how the society as it is currently structured goes about solving the homelessness problem. I certainly don't have any ideas.
Well, affordable housing. Let's bring Michael in on this one. Mike, and Kenny, of course, lives out in California, so he sees this all the time. But let me bring Mike into this.
Well, actually,
Who's
I
going to
have
get something to drink, non-alcoholic.
You can go get a bottle of whiskey. You might need it. I think I have a more firsthand appreciation of this as I am kind of on the road towards eviction. So I think in New York, I hope it's still the evictions can't be processed, can't be put through until January. And then, of course, it'll take months after that. I'm sure there'll be some backup. But the fact of the matter is, I am in serious danger of losing the apartment. And there aren't many places I can go. Now, again, different people, this is something that nobody takes into consideration. They say, well, you can always find a place to live somewhere under a tent or something like that. Well, different people have different health issues. They have different chronological issues. When we're older, we can't, there are certain things we can't do. There are certain limitations on where and how we can live. And I'm facing up to those right now. And when you go through and you throw out all the things that you want, and you're just left with what you need in order to function, you're still left with a situation, at least in New York, and I'm sure in most other cities, where there isn't anything affordable out there. Again, if people just want to live in a room somewhere or something, but that's not a healthy society. Certainly would be healthy from my point of view. So, and I can also say that as far as affordable housing, the affordable housing, a lot of the affordable housing out there is really a trap. Then it's not really, it's in name, in other words, it's being put out there like these 80-20 buildings, or, these companies that say, okay, we have affordable housing, but you have to go through the company, and their gimmick is to not give affordable housing to people who look like they're going to be staying there long term, because in a lot of these situations, if somebody takes the affordable housing and then moves out in 2 years, that housing can go to market value in a lot of these situations. So again, there's a lot of traps, pitfalls, cracks in the applications for affordable housing, and the application process itself is almost almost fascistic. In other words, there are people who, in other words, they do spot inspections to make sure that you're not a hoarder or anything like that. But again, it's up to the person who comes in and makes the inspection to decide whether or not that person should go in the building, the amount of paperwork, the runarounds that happens with the paperwork, the lack of help there is in applying to help with people applying for this paperwork. I mean, if it were just me, I wouldn't even be bringing it up, but it's more than half the people I know who are applying for these things. Older people, of course, may not have the computer skills to deal with this stuff. So I don't know. I mean, the only thing I can say is that it seems that in many other countries, not all, not nearly all, but in a lot of other countries, they seem to have found a way around this. Of course, that would include moving the country a little bit more towards socialism, not necessarily becoming a socialist country, but we are a hybrid right now. That's Social Security could be called.
Boy, that's
socialism.
a surprise to me.
No. We're a hybrid in that to a right-wing reactionary, the Social Security, income tax, all these things are perceived as socialism.
All right.
So as far as housing goes, my opinion is, they've got to do something about it. I don't know, it's, not just for individuals like myself, but for the society to function. I don't, otherwise if we go to the depression where people are standing on the street corner selling apples, even though there aren't enough apples to sell anymore, and people being thrown out of the homes and everything like that, we go to the depression. The only way we got out of the depression really was with World War II. So we're not leaving ourselves a lot of positive options here. However,
Michael.
There are ways to deal with it.
All right, Michael, look, the issue is very simple in New York City and other places. They statistically have shown that the only solution to this is cheap, affordable housing, period. And the lack of it is what causes these things. The amount of people who, for example, when rent control went away, there were I think there were 1.5, 1.6 million people living on rent control in 1969 in New York City. Now I think there are less than 60,000 family units under rent control. So cheap, affordable housing, rent control, at least in New York, I don't have to tell you. I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment for many years. I only paid $150 a month. Those days are gone like the dinosaur. So the problem, and for a case something like you face, is that the amount of affordable, cheap housing that's decent is very limited. And that's been a social policy practical outcome of a whole bunch of measures at the federal, state, and local level now for decades. And so all these people on the streets, and of course some of them, one could say, some have mental health problems, some have drug addiction problems, but I would say most of the people I've seen or talked to in the shelter system in New York City, they're just people who lost their jobs in some cases and had hard times and hard luck. And most New Yorkers are about 2 to 3 paychecks from losing their apartment. I remember a study was released a few years ago that showed about 70% of New Yorkers lived on the edge. So to me, what is a deeper issue of all this is the fact that even with de Blasio, with all his bullshit, and I give him credit at least for trying to put on the stream affordable housing, there just isn't enough of it. And that's one of the inadequacies. And I'd say the thing that I agree with Sanders and the Progressive Caucus in the Congress is that, yes, they wanted to solve these problems. And the issue always collides with the fact that in local politics in America, real estate interests are always the most powerful interests politically, locally. Kenny, you live in LA. We see all these things all the time. And, I remember the last time I was in San Francisco years ago, I was sort of mind blown by the amount of people living on the streets compared to what I saw. And I'm talking about like 2001 is the last time I was in San Francisco. And so right now I understand it's even nuttier. So what do you feel about the homeless issue in the state of California?
Well, this is going to be, I'm not saying this is a joke. It's true. The people aren't homeless. They're living in tents and they're supplied with food, medical care, counseling, everything. They're just living in tents. They're not living in structures. Some of them are living in structures. Some of them don't want to live in structures because they have a 10 o'clock curfew and no drugs or alcohol. In a park about 5 minutes from here, they had 250 trailers set up and people could live in those trailers, but it was a 10 p.m. curfew, no drugs, no alcohol, and no music at night and so forth. So it's kind of like an outdoor prison, in the park. It was in the parking lot of the park. But in any event, and I went and took a look at this lady's website, Harriet Fraud, and she basically feels the basic problem, at least in this country, is capitalism causing rape and poverty and everything. It's all because of capitalism. So there is one thing I feel is true about that. Trying to deal with the homeless is like trying to handle the mosquitoes that are in the house. You have to go outside and take a look. Where are the mosquitoes coming from? I don't mean to be derogatory about the homeless, that they're mosquitoes. I don't mean it that way. It's like trying to say, how come these flowers keep coming up? Well, there's a plant underneath it and it's in the ground and it's getting water and sunlight. The plant, the flowers are a consequence of the whole ecosystem. And the homelessness is a consequence of the whole economic system in this country, where there's education and there's counseling and there's family structure and there's organizations. It seems very obvious to me, a majority of these people do not belong to any kind of affilial associations, because I know I happen to live in a neighborhood that's mostly observant Jews. So they have 4 or 5 sections where they help people that are having trouble. They give out money to people that are poor or indigent, or the husband died, or they lost their job, or medical bills, or whatever. And they don't just do it for Jewish people, they do it for everything. I don't even know what the names of the organizations are because I haven't worked for them as a volunteer and I haven't needed to go in as a client. But there are social organizations in this country, or used to be, or I'm sure they're still there, and they work to ameliorate these situations. I know that the Catholic Worker does that. I had a friend who used to go down and work in a soup kitchen all the time. So it's a question of, you're looking at these flowers, the people that are living in tents, rather than calling them homeless, living outside, and it's the effect, it's the result, it's a phenomena which is indicative of a certain economic, ecological situation in the society. How come they're living in tents? And it could go down to 15 different reasons. And it wouldn't matter if there were 3 or 4 people living in tents, but in LA, there's like 50,000. And it's like a big long avenue, miles and miles of tents and tents and tents. The reason I'm saying they're living in tents is they're not in a tent with a sleeping bag. They pull up shopping carts, they build structures, they turn it into a domicile, and they live there. And one of the consequences of that, if you take a look at it, common sense will tell you, it's going to be very hard to get a job back, because I have to leave my tent. I don't have any security. Whatever I accumulate, I'd have to leave in the tent. And when I go to work, it could get stolen. And where am I going to take a shower? Even if I had maybe I have a facility, I live near a YMCA and stuff. But I've talked to people who lived in cars and mostly lived in cars. And they do try to stay, or they get a membership in a YMCA so they can have facilities for hygiene and bathing and stuff. I did a program with homeless people. And when the reason they hang around parks is before the big tent encampments, because they can go into the restroom and take what they call a bird bath, freshen up, but it's very hard for them to get back to work, because you don't realize, when you go out for a job interview, you take a shower, you shave, you spruce up, you put on your tie, a nice iron shirt. They can't do that. And they probably don't have the facilities to work remotely, even if they were skilled. So it is a tough thing in the society, and it's a question of all of the elements: unemployment insurance, pensions, 401ks, how many hours a week do you work? What are the, is the money going out of the country? Are the jobs going out of the country? Do we have enough jobs for people with lower skills? Like there was a commentator who said the Army rejects people who have an IQ below 82 because they're not qualified to do anything. They just be a burden. But 82, IQ of 82, whether you believe in IQ or not, is 10% of the population. So if you have a large part of the population that can't operate a cell phone, or they don't have an adequate thing to operate as a cashier or something, you got a major problem coming on. We have automation coming. So there has to be adjustments and monitoring of the whole infrastructure. In other words, homelessness is just an indicator of some illness in the structure of society that goes all the way down to the roots of our activity. And I don't believe by that, oh, somebody's gonna, I have the answer. This is it. Show me a country. The thing to do is take a look where somebody has solved a problem, not somebody who says they have the solution. See someplace where they've solved the problem. Maybe Denmark, Sweden, and Norway have a lot to teach us. That's all I have to say. So I'm not concerned with the homeless. I'm concerned with the underlying faults that creates the phenomenon.
Right. But one of the things that Alex was pointing out is that, and yes, you're right. They do have a program at Columbia Medical School, which actually is an ongoing seminar on homelessness issues. And they have one guy over there that was advocating, the human rights for squatters. He's talking about squatters in Brazil. I mean, he raised it to the point of, around the world, the lack of housing for people, which is a wider thing. And I'm glad you're pointing out the structural issues because, of course, what Harriet was quite right in talking about was the, millions of Americans who lost their jobs as a pandemic, and they're facing eviction, which is a horrible thing. Imagine if you had a couple of kids and you weren't able to go back to work because of all the reasons we know, and then you owe thousands of dollars. And then we also know this program was inadequately supervised. It only got about $6 billion out when they had tens of billions sitting there. So you got all these people who basically got caught in, basically shafted as a result of this. And I think in the state of New York, Dave, Alex, I could be wrong. I think they have put a moratorium on the eviction process right now. Is that correct, Alex?
I don't know the details, but yeah, I think it's
Mike would know
continued.
This. Yeah, but look at the situation Mike is in. I mean, this is ridiculous. Mike should be having help to deal with this kind of situation. And I know that the guidelines, you look at the affordable housing units that exist in New York that open up, they have very strict income guidelines. So you can't necessarily get into them. And I trust me, I know I applied to many of them, so I know the kind of things that happen with them. But anyway, let's move on to the other stories you want to talk about, Alex.
No. I want to hear what Steve has to say about the.
All right, go on, Steve.
I'm not on right now.
Oh, who was that? Michael, you wanted to jump in there with some comment?
Well, I wanted to say, yeah, everything you're saying, what you just said is correct. A lot of those guidelines, those income guidelines, are basically, they're just playing games. In other words, they're saying you've got to meet those guidelines because if you don't meet those guidelines, then they can eventually turn it over to open market. But I think that's market value. But I think the problem also that's happening here, which we haven't seen to any great degree since the Depression, is that this isn't just the poor that are homeless. This is the middle class.
Right.
This could be the nail in the coffin of the middle class in this country. If middle class people are being evicted and are being homeless, then again, obviously they won't be able to hold on to their middle class jobs. This would be the destruction of the middle class in this country if it gets into the millions.
Well,
okay.
Well, it has indeed got. This has been going on now for 50 years, with the decline of decent, well-paying jobs for people who only have a high school graduate degree. I mean, we saw this in the Rust Belt. Look at what goes on in. I was a member of a union where the average pay per worker in 1971 was $8 an hour. That's pretty good pay in 1971 as an hourly basis. That particular job disappeared and left New York. A couple hundred people. Last time I went out to see those guys with 76, they all had gone on strike to prevent Kraftco from moving that company out of Long Island City. That job is gone. So what happened to all those guys who worked in that job? How were they affected by it? And then, and let me just add that your point about this, Michael, is well taken, because people. I know a woman who had a kid who got into a Section 8 housing unit on East 45th Street, of all places in New York City, to move into an affordable housing unit on East 45th Street on the Upper East Side. But, that is far and few. And again, the lack of commitment to sound public housing as a social policy has been going on since the 1950s in the United States. But let's move on to Alex.
No. The thing I was going to say, Jim, is that there
No. We got to move on to Steve. Steve, what do you got to say about the homelessness?
Well, I think everybody on the panel has the same view. This is a symptom of the gradual decline of capitalism. And, there are a lot of things we don't have in this country, beginning with that compared to other advanced capitalist countries, although some of them, like England, don't have guaranteed housing either. But we don't have national health insurance. We don't have paid family leave. The list, it's a fairly extensive list. But just a side point, one of the organizations of physicians that is out in front with anti-vax, anti-mandate is an organization that was formed, the American Association of Physicians and Surgeons, which was originally formed in 1943 to oppose the legislation that they knew would be coming after the war for national health insurance. And they were believe it or not, they were to the right of the AMA. So we don't have national health insurance, and we certainly don't have guaranteed housing. And and Jim, you talked about being in a union in 1970. It's been an objective of the ruling class in this country, which they have achieved to a very high level, to destroy the unions or to destroy effective unions. And that began in 1947 with the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act. And it's continued onwards. The countries which have the best social support networks are countries which still have strong or reasonably strong labor unions, and those are the countries of Western Europe and Scandinavia. So I don't see any solution. I think this is just going to get worse and worse. But the ravages of capitalism are just getting worse and worse. The problem is there's no hope of a leading party in this country to begin to build towards, would be way down the road, but towards a revolutionary movement. The idea that the Greens are going to do this is ridiculous, and the idea that you can achieve this through elections also is ridiculous. Lenin had it right, and I think it was in the State and Revolution, when he said, every 4 years you get a chance to vote, and the votes don't mean very much. And that was a summary of a very nice paragraph that I have. I think it's from State and Revolution. But yeah, I don't have anything hopeful to add here.
All right. Okay, Alex, your next story, man. Let's hear it.
Okay, I'll share. Okay. Well, for us, I guess I'm probably the only soccer fan here, unless Steve is also. But again, this whole FIFA scandal keeps on going, and now it's resolved.
Oh, soccer.
Yeah.
You mean? Well, actually, it's football, but
yes, that's the real football, not the crappy American, which I enjoy as well. But it's not.
They finally got these.
That's rugby with pads. Right. And yeah, so again, so actually, yeah, the Swiss authorities are actually initiating. They're prosecuting the former head of FIFA, the well, it's because forget the Fédération Internationale du Football Association or something like that. Yeah,
something like
It's the international organization that runs
Right.
the World Cup and everything.
Yeah.
So they've been indicted now. So here's a piece from France 24 on it.
It's the latest development in a scandal that has rocked the world of football these past years. After a 6-year investigation, Sepp Blatter and Michel Platini, the former heads of the international governing...
What kind of meat is healthiest for your cat?
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
FIFA and of the European authority UEFA are both being charged for fraud in Switzerland. The country's Attorney General Office said that a payment made to Michel Platini in 2011 held no legal basis, bringing damage to FIFA's assets while enriching the former UEFA boss. Blatter and Platini were both banned from the sport over the case and have denied any wrongdoing, with Platini saying he's confident about the outcome of the charges. The pair claim that the French football star was owed 2 million Swiss francs for work dating back to a decade earlier. Michel Platini has previously been questioned in a separate case regarding suspicions over Qatar's winning bid to host next year's World Cup. The two men should now face trial within months at a federal criminal court.
Right. Well, anybody who knows anything about FIFA knows that it's always been corrupt, that it's, notorious for having essentially the World Cup almost bought and sold essentially between, that kind of a highest bidder situation almost in terms of who gets it, which is again how no name country like Qatar, with the ridiculous idea of holding the World Cup in summer in a desert country, and they're actually going to do it. And of course, that resulted in hundreds and thousands of workers dying to build. I think it's Qatar and to build the soccer stadiums that are going to be used. That again will probably be rarely used again. And there's a whole thing about also there's a good book out there that talks about how the World Cups and the Olympics have been used repeatedly as in order to gentrify developing nations, like Brazil or Los Angeles, if you go back to '84, apparently. So this is well known, but yeah. All right. So to move on to another French 24, again, I thought this was rather interesting. Again on gender equality in France, and again, this group is trying to bring light on the subject by pointing out that French women, because of the pay disparity, are basically working for free from now the beginning of November through the end of December, relative to the wage men get. So let's play this.
Now, how's this for a statistic? Starting today, for the rest of the year, the average woman in France is essentially working for free. That's because men are paid over 16% more than their female co-workers for doing the same or an equivalent job. To discuss the pay gap, my colleague Annette Young, the host of the 51%, is with me in the studio. And Annette, the figure's shocking enough as it is, but actually the pay gap is getting worse. It's gone from 15.5% in 2019 to 16.5% this year. Why are things getting worse?
Well, one big word, it's called the pandemic. And may I point out, Nadia, I hope you're feeling charitable because you and I apparently are working for free from now onwards until the end of the year. Well, we could be laughing, but, it's not a great figure, as you point out. In fact, it's pretty grim. What happened last year is, of course, the global economy went into free fall once the pandemic hit in March 2020 and right across the world. And those who are impacted the most within the workforce are those who are paid the less, of course, not to mention the fact, for instance, in America alone, 3 million women, I'm going to repeat that statistic, 3 million women have lost their jobs between March 2020 and to this point, which is an extraordinary chunk of the US labour force. So many out there are most likely being told by their bosses and companies to forget pay rises as the economies start to slowly rebuild. it should come as no surprise that the pandemic has exacerbated the gender pay gap to the disadvantage, particularly of women with family responsibilities, due largely to childcare and educational requirements imposed by COVID-19 lockdowns. And of course, women bear the burden of care when it comes to looking after their families. And another important growing statistic to take into account when you talk about caring for others is aged parents, because the workforce is getting older. Our parents are living longer. So in addition, there's that as well. A study conducted by Ipsos in the US has shown that the gender gap for childcare responsibility, sadly, is growing. It's not going the other way as it should be. It's going in reverse. But when we look at the pay gaps, where does France stand? Well, when it comes to Europe as a whole, it does perform better than Germany, but it's certainly worse than the European average, which is 14.1, and the American pay gap is around 16%.
Clearly something needs to change then here in France, and what needs to be done at a governmental level and also at the level of companies?
Well, back in 2017, when he first assumed the job, President Macron said that gender equality was his #1 priority. And sadly, here we are 4 years on, and look at what we have. We have a pay gap which is worsening. It's certainly increasing, not decreasing. So how do you close the gap? Legislation certainly helps, but top economists have pointed out a little toolkit for companies and workplaces to use. First of all, information about salaries needs to be shared. You need to share that salary information. It needs to be far more transparent. You need to, increase the minimum wage. You need to offer policies that allow families of both men and women to share the burden of childcare. So, equal amounts of parental leave for both mothers and fathers, or whoever's looking after children per se. Now, for the employees, here's a little toolkit one may suggest. So get your pen and paper ready. When you're looking for a job, ask the following questions of your potential employer. Do women generally wait longer than men for promotions? Are female workers being shunted into lower paid jobs? Is the company culture welcoming to women? Look at things like childcare policy, holiday leave, leave in terms of family emergencies. And are there gender differences in non-salary compensation, such as bonuses, overtime opportunities, and stock options? I mean, obviously that's the high end of the workplace, but there are enough questions there that I think all of us should be asking of our employers, because as much as the onus is on governments, and it is on businesses, it's also on us as workers to be smart about it. So we've all got to play a part in this in order to decrease that gender pay gap.
All right, really interesting stuff. Thanks very much indeed, Annette Young, for us there on the.
Okay, so I guess now this is an opportunity for us, since we're all men here, to flagellate ourselves about the gender pay gap. And I mean, it's that was very interesting to hear that they're actually France is worse than the U.S., which I didn't think anybody was worse than the U.S.
Well, look, Alex, my mother was the first affirmative action officer for the city of Oakland. And so that's in 1972. So I listened to all these horror stories her entire career. Nothing fucking changed at all. It got a little better, but look at what happened when the HRA, when the ERA didn't pass in the late 70s. And so we've never recovered from that. That's been, and then of course that's associated with the rise of the right, with them exploiting the West Virginia textbook issue. And then of course they exploited the abortion issue, and that just fed right into the ERA. And then I don't have to tell you again, the sophistication of the right and their rebellion against this, the ERA was just one part of it. So the issue of the gender gap in pay is just simply part of the inequalities of our society that haven't changed that much in the past 50 years. Steve, you want to say something about that from the university side?
I don't really have anything to add, although I'm not surprised that France is worse than us. I mean, we're pretty bad, but I'm not surprised that France is worse. I mean, they've got the, male chauvinism Oh my gosh, I hope there's no Francophile on here. But male chauvinism.
Technically, I have, Steve.
Huh?
But technically, I have, since my degree is in French history. So
I see. Well, all right, then
I speak the language,
correct me
etc.
if I'm wrong, but I think male chauvinism is the French society from way back.
Indeed, yeah. I wouldn't disagree with you there.
Okay.
All right, so let's
move on, Alex.
Okay, so here we have another thing from a few days ago. We haven't said too much about what's been going on in Sudan.
Alex, could you zoom it up?
Oh yeah, I'll full screen it. Yeah. So things have increasingly escalated there with the demonstrations in the street, getting shot at by the military. But there seems to have been a real, large scale uprising essentially. And there, we Americans could take some cues here on how to basically shut the capital of your country down, which is essentially what the people of Sudan have done in Khartoum, at least in, recent days. So they've really put, essentially shut things down, and they're demanding that they immediately return to civilian power and have elections very, very soon. So essentially, they're demanding, say, we're going to stay in the streets. So it doesn't matter if you shoot us until you restore civilian authority, essentially, and give up on your coup. But of course, again, the military always has the monopoly of force, so we'll have to see if this can. But so far, again, seems to be working in terms of the people, again, literally shutting the city down.
Across Khartoum, barricades have brought traffic to a halt. The youth have been protesting since they found out about the coup.
We're blocking the roads to ensure our security, so that when the military forces come, they can't reach us. If they reach us, they will shoot to kill us. They killed our brothers over there, next to the military headquarters. We're also calling for civil disobedience. We don't want to see anyone at work, in the offices, in the pharmacies, and we want to block everything in the country.
All around, cars are blocked and the majority of shops are closed. Khartoum is a dead city. Only certain grocery shops were encouraged to stay open.
The first 2 days we closed, but then people called us and asked if we could reopen. All shops were closed and people started to get hungry. I opened so they could have some food. You see, there are a lot of people here.
Professional unions and neighborhood committees are behind the blockade. Created after the ouster of Omar Al-Bashir, they want to ensure that the revolutionary ideals are protected. Dua is a member of the committee of Khartoum East. She's hiding to avoid arrest.
We are putting pressure on them with this strike, but it should not only be civil servants who participate. It will only be successful if society as a whole comes together. Like the woman who sells tea at the roadside cafe, everything should shut down. That would stop those in power. People are following the schedule that we have set. On October 30th, there will be a big protest that will bring millions of people together. That way, we will bring down these people like we brought down Bashir.
The Constitution provides that on November 17th, the leadership of the Sovereignty Council of Sudan should be transferred to a civilian leader. If a civilian government is not in place by then, they say that they will escalate their movement.
All right, Alex, let me share the screen for a second. I have something I want to share on this. The Sudan, of course, is a quite complicated situation. It's one that is worthy of always a lot of explanation. Let me just see where this is. Yeah, here we go. This is from Al Jazeera English. Now, this is one of these long pieces, like, why did this happen?
Full screen, please.
What?
Full screen.
All right, hold tight. Let me just get the shake computer sound. All right, here we go.
Who's out of Sudan, where the military has arrested several civilian ministers and officials.
Thousands of people have taken to the streets to protest against Monday's military coup.
This guy, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, has taken control and kicked out the prime minister. People are really angry. They're back on the streets like they were 2 years ago. That's when they brought down a president they blamed for 30 years of oppression. So what's going on? Who's who in all of this? And where does Sudan go from here? Okay, first, let's wind things back and talk about Omar Al-Bashir. He took power in a military coup in 1989 and ruled Sudan for the next 30 years. But 2 years ago, people finally turned on him. Women, young people, Sudanese from across the country had had enough. And when it became clear that al-Bashir's days were numbered, the army, which had propped him up for so long, turned on him too, and he was out. But it wasn't quite the people's victory that all those protesters had wanted, because the army seized power and replaced Bashir with something called the Transitional, the TMC. So as far as the protesters were concerned, the revolution wasn't over.
People, they came, they set up their tents, and they just refused to leave in front of the army headquarters. And their demands was very clear that we want the military to hand in the government to the civilians. And we want to move towards democracy, and we want to move towards peace.
But there was nothing peaceful about what happened next.
That is the scene.
More than 100 people were killed in what became known as the Cartoon Massacre.
Armed forces attacked the protesters with live ammunition.
It was a horrific situation. People's bodies were thrown into the Nile. Women and men were assaulted.
Still, the protesters kept up the pressure, and it worked. Eventually, the military agreed to share power. So, the military leaders, the TMC, made a deal with the group that basically represented the protesters. That's the FFC, the Forces of Freedom and Change. They agreed to share power for 39 months in a new transitional government and then hold elections. Both sides had seats on a joint committee called the Sovereign Council. That was led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. Remember, he's the guy who just led the coup. There was also a civilian cabinet led by Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok. Now, for a while, it looked like Sudan was on track and transitioning towards democracy. But that transition was completely derailed by what happened in late October, when General al-Burhan decided to seize power. He dissolved the Sovereign Council, pushed out the Prime Minister, and declared a state of emergency.
It's a naked, brutal power grab. What he is trying to do is to...
For just $67, you can make as many videos as you want, and you never need to pick up a camera.
Tear up the aspirations of the Sudanese people as expressed in the 2019 revolution.
Okay, but why now? Well, that whole power-sharing arrangement was on pretty shaky ground from the start.
The military were never comfortable with sharing power with the civilians. So the grudge was there.
Having two parts of the government that are not actually in agreement, in terms of their political agenda, in terms of their ultimate goals, has been extremely problematic.
So that's the context. A major rivalry between the two sides that was just getting worse and worse. But there was something else going on too. A looming deadline for General al-Burhan to step down as chairman of the Sovereign Council. Some people reckon that also helps to explain the timing of this coup.
3 or 4 weeks before Burhan was supposed to hand over his chair to a civilian one. That's why he decided to turn the tables against everyone.
And stepping down would have put the civilian side in a stronger position to make some big moves, like handing over the former president Omar Al-Bashir to the International Criminal Court. He's facing charges linked to the conflict in Darfur. a conflict that some of those military leaders, like Al-Burhan, were involved in too. Or another big move, pushing ahead with a proper investigation into the military's role in the Cartoon Massacre.
They were never really going to investigate themselves enough for the massacres of June 2019.
The military has full control now. So what does that mean for Sudan? Well, for the economy, it's definitely bad. Sudan was on its way to getting $50 billion in debt relief, and there were promises of even more international aid. But most of that was tied to Sudan's democratic transition, and now that that's in doubt, so is the money.
We have had debt rescheduling, debt relief, the lifting of the state sponsors of terror designation, the beginnings of economic normalization, and that can be credited to the civilian leadership, and especially to Abdallah Hamdok. Now, there is no chance that the United States, the European Union, the World Bank, etc., are going to come in and say, oh, we don't mind having the democratic transition torn up.
Now, General Al-Burhan actually says he's still committed to that transition. He said the whole reason he took control was to correct the path of the revolution, as he put it, and that the military was forced to act because of all the political infighting.
انقلب التراضي المتزن إلى صراع بين مكونات الشراكة قاد بلادنا ومكوناتها المختلفة إلى انقسامات تنذر بخطر وشيك يهدد أمن الوطن.
He says he's going to set up a technocratic government and hold elections in 2023, but people just aren't buying it.
This is all, window dressing, just to negate the fact that this is a military regime.
And so for many in Sudan, it's feeling like 2019 all over again.
وده ما الانقلاب الأول، الرسالة دارنا نوصلها للعالم.
شو الثورة انتمت لبرهان، برهان انتمى للثورة وقال أنا هحمي ثورة، هل بالله عليك دي حماية؟ دي حماية ثورة؟
We can't predict what might happen next in Sudan. Several people have already been killed in the protests that followed the latest coup, and there's definitely a lot of fear. But there's also some hope. The idea that people power has changed things before, and it might again.
The people in the street, the people who managed to start the civil disobedience without any central leadership, but basically their faith in their right to have a government that is held accountable to them. There's no way we're going to have a military rule in the long term.
All right, so that's the that is a piece that Al Jazeera English played about the coup in the Sudan. The reason I bring this up, I'm preparing a series of lectures on Boko Haram in Nigeria at another situation, and so it's led me to be exploring the coups in Nigeria, which basically is you let the genie out of the bottle in any of these countries in Africa, and the military will never retreat from wanting to taste power again. I should add that my former sister-in-law was in charge of the Sudan at Human Rights Watch. They had in this segment Alex DeWall, who was also at Human Rights Watch. Many years ago, Alex and Rakia Omar quit Human Rights Watch in a very publicized basically event where they were opposed to the U.S. intervening in Somalia and using the excuse of humanitarian intervention to essentially engage in what they felt was neo-imperialism. And Rakia was a person who was herself from Somalia. She later did brilliant work on Rwanda. And Alex, as you can see, I think he's up at Harvard, but he's been a notable person talking about the Sudan for many years. So that's just to let you, a little bit of background on what's going on. These are very important things because the Sudan is considered a country, particularly given the instability in there, politically and socially, where you could have a reaction similar to what happened in Iraq, with the evolution of a jihadist, Salafist kind of political response for all sorts of reasons. It's part of the Muslim world. And there is further south of that area, the raging of the Boko Haram movement that's now split into three movements that has penetrated as far as the Chad, which is not farthest from the Sudan. There's a widespread movement that is politically integral to the area, not necessarily, related to some sort of conspiracy of jihadism, but is rooted in the social dysfunction of the various societies, and Sudan is one of them. So it's important to keep that in mind as we look at these things. Let's bring in the next thing you wanted to talk about, Alex.
Okay, so I wanted to play a little bit longer clip here again, because I'm fussing around with certain, so again, watching some of the clips longer clips that break through news. So Ryan Cox, she's a really good reporter on the Middle East. She actually lives in, Beirut, has been there through, the explosion, and so on, and
full screen.
Yeah. I just want to again explain who she's talking to. Okay, so the gentleman who goes he posts as the Angry Arab. So he's a professor of political science at actually not too far from you, Ken, at Cal State Stanislaus, which I believe is up north, kind of east of San Francisco, and I think it's Turlock, California, is where it's located. So again, he's a professor of political science and essentially a Middle East. Saad Abu Khalil again, and here again I'm playing this because again he had some very interesting revelations here that apparently from the U.S. archives we know that the U.S. and Israel had a great deal more to do with the outbreak of the civil war in Lebanon, and also went on in the early 80s. That essentially the U.S. and Israel they were backing the far right
the Christian
phalangist.
Nothing new. Let's hear what it has to say. Okay.
Right. But apparently there's a guy who's writing a book about it at who's you might have met him, Jim, because he's at Columbia. This guy, Nate George, here. I don't know if you've ever met him. He's writing this book again, Third World War, Palestinian Revolution, Lebanese National, again on the period, and apparently it's his research that he's written. Apparently this is he did his dissertation on this, and again he's writing it as a book here, and again you can see
thank you. It's again nothing revelatory in that, but let's. And I can see.
For people who don't know the history of the Middle East, as much, it's
All right, let's hear
the extent to which, again, they were providing support and money to them and controlling them
and so was Syria.
Sure.
And so were the other countries in the area. Right. Let's hear what these people have to say.
Just get right into it.
Full screen.
As you know, the Lebanese forces led by Samir
share the sound
appear to be kind of like the last weapon of Western imperialism
closed caption
and the Saudis in Lebanon at this point. And we know they were involved in turning the 2019 uprising in Lebanon into a tool to go after Hezbollah and the resistance. We know they get money from the Saudis, and we know they shot at Shia protesters recently. So since they're in the news and getting all this attention, I think it's a good time to kind of go back and explain to people who are these so-called Lebanese forces, what are their origins, and what was their role in the Lebanese civil war and after.
These are the important questions, and I think there's a lot of confusion and misconceptions about what's happening in Lebanon. And I also have to say, I have not been happy with the campaign by Hezbollah and its supporters to elevate unwittingly the status of Samir Jaja. Samir Jaja is not a significant figure, and I worry this recent attention to his person has really increased his price to those who pay him, and that is namely Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Saudi Arabia, for the last couple of years, has cut off funding to all political parties, except groups and personalities here and there, except for the Lebanese forces. They really bank on them. They think, foolishly, that they are able to use them in the future as a bulwark against Hezbollah. And of course, that's fanciful, because the power of Hezbollah has been sufficient to humiliate the Israeli army, let alone a ragtag army of not very highly trained people of the new generation of the Lebanese forces. He is really not a significant figure, but I think that what is happening is significant. And I also believe that the United States relies more on the Lebanese army as a bulwark against Hezbollah. And they foolishly think that this badly trained Lebanese army, which is good enough only for spectacles and shows they do in schools, elementary schools around the country, and they have 4 Cessna planes that they parade, that they are the Lebanese Air Force. And they basically allow them to catch sacks of potatoes and detergent that are passing through Lebanese-Syrian borders. That's their mission. Anything that has to do with the southern Lebanese border, they are not allowed to go there. They're not allowed to have any surveillance posts or anything like that. Only on the eastern and the northern fronts of Lebanon. Samir Jaja is trying to show eagerness, that he is capable of standing to Hezbollah in order to increase his price. But there is evidence, at least footage-wise, that the Lebanese army wasn't involved. The first shots were fired by Lebanese soldiers, in fact, and that is something that has not been highlighted in Lebanon because everybody, and that's part of the Western-funded campaign, want to raise the status and the profile of the Lebanese army. So they are afraid of saying anything negative. And what's funny about Lebanon is that those false, fake revolutionaries who want to change the system and do all that, you notice that they don't say a word about the Lebanese army, which is a very traditional and poorly prepared ragtag force that can barely stand up to thugs in the streets, let alone defend Lebanon. And we are being told by American propaganda and Gulf propaganda that this Lebanese army can be the sole protector of Lebanon, meaning that if Israel were to attack, we don't need the resistance of South Lebanon, that the Lebanese army is capable of handling it. If that's the case, the obvious question is, why did they not lift a finger and they hid in their beds in 2006? Why did they never play a role? And why does the Lebanese army commander today not even dare mention Israeli threats and dangers to Lebanon? The Israeli violations of Lebanon, you're there and you know that, are regular, daily basis almost. And yet the Lebanese army does not respond to that except by saying, we have complained to the UNIFIL forces in South Lebanon about these recent violations, and we will follow up the matter with them. That's the response. That's their strategy as an alternative strategy for the defense of Lebanon. Now, the history of the Lebanese forces is a checkered one, and it is marred and littered with series of massacres and war crimes. Going back all the way to 1958 here. And people who complain about people like you and me, we exaggerate Western intervention, and that we are conspiracy theorists, as you know, we wear that tag proud, because if you don't see Western conspiracies in our land, you really are not informed about what's happening in the last so many decades, and you are not understanding what is happening in the Middle East region as well. Since 1958, Israel and the United States have been heavily involved in Lebanese conflict. In 1958, there was a president who refused to leave his office, and he wanted to renew his term indefinitely. And he took the country to civil war. And he was armed and financed by a combination of Arab reactionary governments, the usual suspects, and the West, United States chiefly, as well as Israel. Israel has been a party to our conflict uninterruptedly since 1948, but certainly in the conflict of 1958. And let us remember, the Phalange Party, the mother party from which came the Lebanese forces, have been proven through Israeli archives to have received funding from Israel for its election campaign as early as the 1950s. And it has been uninterrupted since then. So the civil war did not go the way they wanted. The US Marines were deployed, and there was a formula reached. But basically, from that time, the Lebanese army was the militia of choice for the West and the United States and Israel to stand up to not only the Palestinian resistance, which didn't even exist in the late 50s and early 60s, but to stand up to the left. Remember, Lebanon was an important base for Western conspiracies against leftism. And Gulf regimes and the West invested heavily in Lebanon, in the reactionary force of Lebanon, Phalange and the Ahrar Party and others, in order to fend off the rising tide, not only of the left, but Arab nationalism. And in fact, former chief of the Middle East at the CIA, Archie Roosevelt, in his book, The Lost of Knowing, admits, he said, we treated forces of Arab nationalism as a twin evil like communism of the world. And there was a lot of money and weapons invested in Lebanon to that effect. So by the late 60s, the Palestinian resistance was rising. And that's when the game started. The Phalange Party became the vessel of choice for the United States, Israel, Western government. I mean, Rania, we have now from American archives so many documents, and there were books that were published, dissertations that were published. There was James Stoker's book, Spheres of Influence. There was a dissertation not published, which was written in Sweden. There is a new dissertation by Nate George at Rice University on the Lebanese Civil War, which I cannot wait for it to go public in a book form. And he tells me it is going to be soon published and so on. And we know from there the extent to which the tentacles of the American Western conspiracy were heavily involved inside Lebanon. For example, the Phalange Party was receiving funds and arms from such a large constellation of forces. They were getting, count with me, from the United States, from United Kingdom, from West Germany, from Belgium, from Spain of Franco, from reactionary forces in Italy. They were receiving volunteers from apartheid South Africa. Many of the snipers of the Lebanese Civil War were actually white supremacist snipers of South Africa. And in order to ingratiate themselves with them, imagine the sinister racism of the Phalange. Are you eating something in the microwave, by the way?
No, sorry, that's the AP.
Yeah, I'm kidding.
My apologies. I'm keeping. But no, please continue, because this is important. You know, I'm glad that I just want to make one quick comment. I'm really glad that you're contextualizing this in a sort of like international, like imperialism versus the left in Lebanon, because so often the Lebanese Civil War is framed as this like really chaotic, inexplicable sectarian bloodbath. So please continue, because this is very important what you're saying.
You're so right about that, Rania. And what is disturbing, and you follow Lebanon very closely, is that we have now this new revitalized liberal left, whose connection to the left are non-existent, who are now trying to downplay the role of the Western conspiracy inside Lebanon. And let us face it, I mean, the left has been co-opted by a lot of reactionary forces and has become unrecognizable. I mean, we have left today, from Iraq to Morocco to elsewhere, which basically claim that there is something called Iranian imperialism and Russian imperialism and Chinese imperialism, and it is tantamount to American imperialism. And to the viewers, I say, remember this. Of the officially declared US military bases in the world, there are 800. Of Russian bases in the world, there is one in Tartus, and very modest one. And for China, they have one military base, and that is in Djibouti. I mean, the scale between the two. And most importantly, America has been at war with our region uninterruptedly since 1990. Russia was heavily involved in the war in Syria, granted, for sure. And I am not a fan of that intervention, especially because Russia cooperates with Israel. But can we compare America's heavy-handed military involvement in every Arab country, except Algeria, because they have dignity and self-respect? The military of the United States is present everywhere, in every Arab country. I mean, Lebanon is a major military and intelligence base for the United States.
Okay. So again, obviously, go on. And I'd not heard the thing about the South African snipers. That was interesting. But of course, again, it shouldn't surprise us that the Phalange, because of course, again, that word is a reference to the Phalange in the Spanish Civil War, which was a fascist organization. So they're, and in fact, again, they point out later on that the guy that founded the Phalange Party actually he eagerly went to the Munich Olympics in '36 and was a big fan of Hitler. So yes, I was a literal fascist.
All right, Alex, Steve.
Yeah, Jim, I'm going to have to.
On this,
there's a call I have to take. So,
well, thanks for coming on, Steve.
Good to see all of you, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
All right, thank you, Steve. And we're enjoying with Steve Jonas, Professor Emeritus at Stony Brook, and good night, Steve.
Good
Have a
night.
good night.
Good night, Jim. Good night.
And we're talking about Lebanon. Alex just played us a piece that has to do. Did you want to make any? Oh, Steve is gone. Okay. Well, let's bring Ken on this one before I jump on your case, Alex. Because frankly, there's nothing revelatory about any. The only thing that was interesting about what he said was the question of all the different interests that were. But a lot of this is all well known. I guess there's probably more devil in the details information. But the '58 crisis, which he's referring to, that has to be looked at from the point of view. Another different way of looking at it is he's not explaining that that occurred at the same time that the Hashemite monarchy in Iraq was overthrown by the Baathists. That was a rather bloody coup. That was actually who was killed in that was Faisal from the Lawrence of Arabia film. He was actually a victim of that coup. There was a Ba'ath Party coup that the military overthrew, and they overthrew the Hashemite monarchy. And then, of course, there was a similar coup. That was a coup threat occurred in Jordan. So part of the reason why the United States intervened with the Marines into Lebanon was that they were looking at essentially their entire strategy for creating a NATO-type organization in the Middle East, CENTO, collapse in front of them. Now, what he's talking about with Phalange is interesting. I'll have to go listen to this. I'd be curious to see the dissertations he's referring to. Yeah, I'd like to see the dissertations he's referring to. But one of the things in the third world that is not well explored in terms of the 50s and 60s and 70s is the multilateral approach that Western countries took to support movements and sets of organizations that they deemed as opposed to Arab nationalism. Because remember, at that point, secular Arab nationalism was the big enemy. Nasserism was the big enemy. Pan-Arabism was the big enemy. The same way that now pan-Islamic jihadism is the big enemy. That was the big enemy in the late 50s. And those movements were suppressing, Salafists. Katoub, who comes back from Colorado, I guess he was freaked out watching blonde girls in shorts. He becomes the great Salafist thinker, and he's executed by Nasser during this period of time. So, but again, the issue of all these different interests deciding to merge together and clandestinely support movements is really not that surprising. And again, what's absent from what he just said was the Maronite Christian elements inside Lebanon. I mean, Napoleon III looked on that as a situation where he wanted to intervene. At the same time, he was intervening in Mexico and threatening to set up a state that would align itself with a confederacy during the Civil War in the United States. He also was thinking about sending in French troops, and he did, into Syria to save the Maronite Christians of Lebanon who were being repressed by by the Ottomans. So this is something that, there's something that, is not, you can sort of say, okay, they decide to become allied with all these international forces, but, and they, I guess, in the mind of this person, they're the manifestation of U.S. imperialism and Western imperialism. On the other hand, what's kept out of that is the fact that the Lebanese Christians, of course, had their own legitimate to decide to align with who they wanted to. And I should add that the people that he's referring to did indeed have help. And he sort of poo-pooed the Russian involvement, the Chinese involvement. Well, the Iranian Revolution hadn't happened at this point in time. But they were involved too. They were involved supporting the movements they supported. So, it's sort of amusing to watch these kind of arguments being made. But, if he wants to move into the Civil War period in the 1970s and then the issue of how Hezbollah set up, well, then to deny the fact that Syria directly intervenes to support Hezbollah and nurture it along with Iran after the revolution in '79, I mean, that's an objective fact. So, but anyway, let's bring on Ken. Ken, what's your opinion? What you saw, and I guess the Sudan too, because we sort of went into some depth about that.
Yeah, I was most engaged about the statement you made. You were preparing to do a report, so you're investigating, the association with Sudan. But you were saying you're looking at Boko Haram in 3 different theaters, right?
Correct. I'm looking at Boko Haram in Nigeria, but then it has expanded into Niger, Chad. It has a split, but it actually has an interrelationship to the popularity in these countries of, this kind of form of responses to the dysfunction that exists in their societies.
Okay, so how much of what you've observed so far can you put at the feet of the American military or the CIA?
Not much, because the internal situations inside Nigeria and how a movement like Boko Haram emerged has nothing to do with the United States. The United States is now involved in fighting that movement. They have aided with military aid advisors, Nigeria, Cameroon, Niger, and Chad. So we're actively involved. And one of the things that's lesser known is Lake Chad is a site of a huge environmental disaster, which has essentially fueled the desire of the people in the area to cooperate with movements like Boko Haram. But Boko Haram is like sort of, okay, we're going to basically say fuck you to all the Islamic, traditional movements that exist in Nigeria and the countries around us, because they don't serve our needs. We're going to create a new society based on a very strict adherence to the Sharia, and we're going to kill anyone who opposes us. And that's why Boko Haram, in part, I mean, that's an oversimplification.
And Jim, on that, I have a map from South Front where they show what they say is the current situation around Lake Chad. So let me put that up. Maybe you can comment on what they're.
But to get to what, let's blow that up. Is that the latest one?
Yeah, that's for, again, this is for.
All right.
November 1st here.
All right.
Actually, controlled. Yeah.
All right. Well, actually, the control has gone further westwards. So there is actual guerrilla warfare being mounted in the western parts of Nigeria, beyond Kano and Maradi, over in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as you can see, the area of Cameroon, the expansion of Boko Haram is actually further at its height. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but if you go down to that city, Garawa, down there in the corner, just blow it up again, Alex. Yeah. You got to blow the map up. See that city down there, Garawa? Yeah. That whole area there, they had expanded their influence in terms of politics, political allegiance, and Maiduguri. You see that city right there. That area is again the same kind of. Now again, Sudan is very different. One cannot generalize about these.
They also have a map for Central African Republic. It's more recent.
Yeah, well, Central Africa is another situation, different than this. But these are all different. But then look at it borders on Sudan. Okay, and you have and that's a whole complicated situation inside Central Africa. That these are all very localized conflicts that have mushroomed. We could look at Mozambique. We could look at Somalia. We could look at Mali. The Sudan is a separate situation politically from any of these situations. And the only thing I would say about the piece that was interesting about the Sudan was that who knows what's going to happen with all this, because the military does have monopoly of control.
We didn't say about Ethiopia, but again, that's, like you were saying there, this is...
If you show a map of Ethiopia, blow that up a little bit. That's as of November 1st in Ethiopia.
Yeah.
You lost it. Okay. Now you can see that the Tigrayan forces, put the cursor over the capital, Addis Ababa. So the thrust of the Tigrayans and they remember they won some victories over the Ethiopia. They captured large numbers of Ethiopian troops a few months ago. So, so they're now thrusting toward Addis Ababa, and there is a huge mobilization going on in Ethiopia to oppose them. And that's and these again are separate situations. And then you see Djibouti over here. Djibouti is where not only does the United States has bases, that's where our JSOC, Joint Special
Apparently
Operations.
everybody has. China has a base there. Japan,
China,
has a base.
Japan, France.
I think the French. Yeah.
Yeah, and we fly. If you look at the documents posted at Intercept regarding the drone warfare revelations that Hazel's being thrown in.
Hail, Daniel Hale. Yeah.
Hail. That Hale's being thrown in for the rest of his life. They have declass. They basically have documents he leaked to Intercept that show the ranges of the drones ranging from Djibouti into Yemen and all the way down to Somalia. To be used to attack the people that we're opposing. Somalia, again, is a different situation. Yeah, it's off the map there, but they can range all the way down in Somalia, where they can actually, and they do indeed, strike against Al-Shabaab. And so the Sudan, of course, has to be looked on separately. You showed that piece earlier of another and you brought this piece of Lebanon. The funny thing about the United States right now is if you go into these situations where you have all these Middle East scholars, the United States has been essentially has suffered a series of strategic defeats. And not only in Afghanistan, but certainly Iraq and Syria. We have a large involvement in Syria right now. We're fighting ISIS in Syria still. Trump, remember, if you look at the Woodward book, basically he freaked out the Joint Chiefs of Staff because he wanted to withdraw everybody precipitously before January 20th. So, but anyway, why don't we get in Mike and Kenny onto their comments about all this? Mike?
Gotta mute Mike.
Is Mike still muted? Maybe. Well, Kenny, your comments about this before we close?
Let's close. I have no comment.
All right, Michael, your comments. Let's see what you come up with.
I mean, to me, it just sounds like more of the same shit. First of all, when the guy was talking, I didn't have a lot of what he said has already been confirmed. Some of the other stuff, he didn't confirm it. It's just because he said it doesn't mean it's true. But some of the stuff, a lot of what he said is true. But my feeling is this. I mean, at least in the case of Israel, yeah, of course they're going to support whichever side isn't looking to wipe them off the face of the earth. Okay, basically Israel is in a siege mentality, and so they're going to support the phalangists. If the phalangists are saying, yeah, we don't want to wipe you out, we're not looking to destroy you. Okay, I mean, but that makes sense. I mean, really, the problem is, I mean, you've got a civil war. You've got to find out if you're worried about who's supporting which side. You've got to find out what side do they have a very good reason to support. Maybe the other side, the side that they're supporting that side against, is looking to do them serious harm. I don't know. It may be a strategic pawn game, or it may just be a self-defense game. As far as the Civil War goes, again, you can't blame the entire Civil War on other countries. You can't just say, hey, it's their fault. We had nothing to do with it. Okay? It's a mixed bag. So, I don't know. I guess people can say whatever they want, and whatever's going to happen there is going to happen. But I think they need to look at, if they're worried about getting support from certain countries, they have to look at what their side, whatever side they happen to be on, what their side's position are they threatening other countries?
All right.
I mean,
all right. Well, what I found interesting. Thank you, Alex, for bringing that up because it piqued my interest. I'm going to go look for the dissertations these guys have written and see what they've come up with.
Again, that one by Nate George sounds. I don't know if you've met him since
I've not met Nate because unfortunately the pandemic is going on. He looks like he's a
I think he's at Rice now, but I guess he was.
Yeah, well, he was probably he had a fellowship.
Right.
It was at the Center for Palestine Studies. It looks like to me, but anyway, it's a very interesting topic, and I'd be open to see what kind of stuff they've dug up. The only thing I can think of when I hear about Lebanon is I remember years ago we had. Unfortunately, it was when NIMAS was getting off the ground. We had a officer come in from the military academy who was commanding the basically the radar acquisition battery that the Joint Chiefs of Staff had sent to Beirut Airport. And he was in the southern tip of the airport complex the day that the Marine barracks was attacked by the suicide bombers. And as you remember, not only was the Marine barracks attacked, but the French embassy was attacked. And I believe they attacked the British embassy too. But they blew up a bunch of French Foreign Legion people, paratroopers, and then they blew up there's multiple attacks that occurred that day. And his whole comment was, as soon as the mission changed from, remember, the whole mission into Lebanon was essentially to effect a withdrawal of the Palestinians, so the Palestinians could, quote, evacuate. Once we shifted and then New Jersey started to support the Phalange in combat with the various Lebanese forces that were engaged with them, then everything changed. And then, of course, we know that Hezbollah and Iran were responsible for that.
Yeah. Okay, Jim, let's wrap it up, okay? Because it's kind of like almost 8 o'clock. I mean, 11 o'clock over there.
Well, anyway. All right.
You could go on, and
anyway, fine. Okay, well, you were listening to Going Viral, GoingViral.news. My name is Jim Dingeman. We were joined on the air with Steve Jonas, Michael Jankowitz, Alex Stavropoulos, and Ken Aaron, West Coast to East Coast.
Just forgetting Ted Cook.
And we had a brief but short appearance from Ted Cook, and hopefully he'll join us again. But anyway, we want to thank you and good night.